The letter hit the floor of the Dry Creek post office like a stone thrown through glass. Not because anyone dropped it. Because Harold Finch, the postmaster, the man who had held that position for 22 years and believed that gave him authority over everything that passed through his town, picked it up from the incoming mail stack, read the return address, Boston, Massachusetts, and laughed, loud. The kind of laugh that wasn't really laughter at all, the kind that was meant to cut. "Well, boys," he said to the two farmers leaning against the counter. "Looks like Silas Mercer's got himself a pen pal." He held the envelope up to the light like he was checking it for contraband. "A woman, Boston." He said the word Boston the way some men say foreign. Wrote him 3 pages from the weight of it. One of the farmers, Deke Calloway, who hadn't had an original thought since the McKinley administration, shook his head and grinned. "Man builds a house with an empty chair on the porch. Now he's getting love letters from women who've never smelled a cow in their lives." Harold set the envelope down on the counter. He didn't hand it over. He just left it there between them, like it was a joke they were all in on. "Somebody ought to tell him," Harold said, "that you can't order a wife like you order seed corn." If you had been standing in that post office on that gray Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1887, watching Harold Finch hold another man's private letter up to the light while the farmers laughed, you would have felt something tighten in your chest. Not just anger, something older than anger. The feeling you get when you watch someone be humiliated for daring to want more than the life other people decided was enough for them. And you would have asked yourself without meaning to, what would I have done if that letter was mine? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. This channel tells stories about real courage, real heartbreak, and real people who refuse to give up on the life they imagined. If that's the kind of story that keeps you up at night in the best possible way, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss one. And after you watch, I want you to drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit the like button too. It genuinely helps more people find their way here. Now, let's go back to Nebraska and to a man named Silas Mercer who was about to walk through that post office door. Silas didn't know about the laugh. Not yet. He came in from the cold with mud on his boots and a knot in his jaw from a morning that had already gone sideways. The north fence had come down overnight. 2 steers had wandered into Calloway's barley field, and he'd spent 3 hours in a wind that felt personal fixing what shouldn't have broken in the first place. He was tired in the way that lives inside the bones. Not the tired you sleep off, the tired that accumulates. He was 33 years old. He had the hands of a man who'd been working since he was 9, and the eyes of someone who had spent too many evenings alone reading by poor lamplight. He wasn't what anyone would call handsome in a deliberate way. His face was the kind that took time to understand. Strong jaw, a quietness around the mouth that people sometimes mistook for coldness until they knew him better. He never mistook it himself. He knew exactly what it was. It was loneliness that had learned to behave. He stepped up to the counter. Harold Finch was still smiling the tail end of a smile he hadn't quite put away yet. The letter was sitting on the counter between them. Silas saw it, saw his name on it, saw the Boston postmark. His heart did something involuntary and private. He reached for it. Harold put 2 fingers on it first, not blocking it exactly, just touching it. "Big envelope," Harold said. "Must be quite the letter." Silas looked at the man's fingers on his mail. He looked up at Harold's face. "It is my letter," Silas said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing about Silas's voice. It never rose, which, in certain situations, made it far more dangerous than if it had. Harold lifted his fingers, smiled wider, which made it worse. Silas took the letter, tucked it into his coat, and left without another word. He didn't open it in town. He didn't open it on the wagon ride back. He waited until he was inside, coat still on, the stove not yet lit, the house around him cold and dim and entirely his own. He set the envelope on the kitchen table. He sat down across from it like it was another person. He thought about the chair on the porch. Bull. He'd built the house 14 months ago. People in Dry Creek had opinions about that, and they shared them freely. The way small communities do when someone does something that unsettles the unofficial rules everyone else has been living by without naming. The rules in Dry Creek were roughly these. You work the land, you marry a local woman, or at least a nearby one. You don't expect too much from the arrangement. You don't build a house with a second chair and leave it sitting there, empty and deliberate, like a declaration. Silas had built it anyway. He hadn't done it out of eccentricity. He wasn't a romantic in the way novels describe. He didn't believe in fate or destiny or the idea that love arrives like weather, beyond your control. He was a practical man. But he had watched, over the years, what happened to the men around him who married out of proximity rather than genuine recognition. He'd watched his own father do it. Marry a woman who was available, who was acceptable, who cooked and cleaned and faded into the wallpaper of their lives until neither of them remembered what the other had originally looked like. He'd watched that marriage turn into a kind of low-grade sadness that never fully broke the surface, never boiled over into crisis, never gave anyone enough to point at, just a long, slow diminishment that lasted until his father's last morning alive. Silas had decided at some point in his late 20s, not dramatically, but firmly, the way you close a gate, that he would rather sit in that chair alone for the rest of his life than fill it with the wrong person just to avoid the embarrassment of it being empty. That was the practical side of the chair, but there was another side, and he almost never thought about it directly. It was the side that had placed the advertisement in the Boston Evening Transcript 4 months earlier. The advertisement that had read, and people in town had gotten hold of a copy and read it aloud in the saloon, apparently, which he'd heard about and chosen to ignore, like this: Rancher, 33, Dry Creek, Nebraska. Not searching for a housekeeper, not searching for a mother for future children, though children are welcome if they come. Searching for a person, a woman, who wants to build something deliberate, who has her own ideas about what a life should look like and isn't afraid to say so, who understands that the frontier is hard and isn't looking for easy. I have a house. I have a porch with 2 chairs. One of them has been waiting longer than I'd like to admit. If you think you might understand what I mean by that, write to me. I will write back. He hadn't expected much. He'd done it partly because the silence in the house had started to have a particular quality. Not peaceful, but expectant, like a room waiting for furniture. And partly because he'd been honest enough with himself, alone on the porch one late September evening, to admit that he was tired in a way that sleep couldn't address. He'd gotten 47 responses. 43 of them were exactly what he'd feared. Women describing their domestic skills with the resigned efficiency of someone submitting a job application, or young girls who had romanticized the frontier in ways that a single Nebraska winter would have dismantled completely. 2 of them were clearly written by family members on the woman's behalf, which told him everything he needed to know. One was a misaddressed letter intended for a hardware supplier, and then there was the 47th. He had read it 3 times the night it arrived. Then he'd folded it, put it in the drawer by his bed, and stared at the ceiling for an hour. Then he'd gotten up and read it a 4th time. It began, I almost didn't write this. I've started it 4 times and thrown it away. This is the 5th attempt, and I'm sending it before I lose my nerve again, so forgive the scratched out word in the 3rd paragraph. I couldn't find a cleaner sheet. There was, in fact, a scratched out word in the 3rd paragraph. It was scratched out so thoroughly he couldn't read it, which bothered him in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the importance of a single word. He found himself wanting to know what it was. The letter was from a woman named Vivian Hale, Boston, 29 years old. She worked as a compositor at her father's printing shop, which meant, she explained, that she set type by hand, letter by letter, for other people's words all day, every day, and had been doing so since she was 15. I have spent the better part of my adult life, she wrote, making other people's sentences look exactly right. I have opinions about sentences. I have opinions about a great many things that I rarely get to use, since the printing business is, in my experience, not interested in the opinions of the person setting the type, only in their accuracy. She wrote about Boston the way someone writes about a place they love, and are also tired of, with affection and a kind of restlessness underneath that she didn't try to hide. She wrote about her father, who was a decent man and a hard worker and who needed her, which was a fact and not a complaint, but still a fact. She wrote about the window of the shop that looked out onto a street she'd looked out of for 14 years, and how she sometimes watched people walk past with somewhere to be and felt something she couldn't quite name. "I don't know what I'm looking for," she wrote near the end. "I know that's not a useful thing to say to a stranger, but I've told you in 4 previous drafts that I'm looking for adventure and a fresh start and various other things that sounded like something a person is supposed to want, and they all felt like lies. The honest answer is, I don't know yet. What I do know is that I read your advertisement and something about it wouldn't leave me alone. You wrote about building something deliberate. I think about that phrase more than I should. I think deliberate is exactly the word I've been missing." He had written back within 2 days. He was not a natural letter writer. His first draft was 6 sentences, all of them clipped and informational, and he'd read it back and felt ashamed of it. He wrote a second draft, a third. He ended up somewhere between the sparse practicality he defaulted to and the genuine thing underneath it, and he sent it before he second-guessed himself into silence. That had been 4 months ago. Now her letter was on his table, the 4th one, and the house was cold and getting colder, and he reached out and picked it up and opened it. She had a way of beginning letters mid-thought, as if she'd been having the conversation in her head for days before she sat down to write it. "I've been thinking about what you said," this one started, "about the winter. The way you describe the cold is something that gets into the house, even when all the windows are closed. I've been trying to imagine it. I'm not sure I can. Boston has cold winters, but I suspect what you're describing is a different animal entirely. I'm not afraid of it, or at least I don't think I am. Though you were right to mention it, and I appreciate that you did. It would have been easy not to." Silas read that paragraph twice. He appreciated that she noticed that. He had spent 3 letters now giving her, carefully and without drama, a precise account of what the frontier was actually like. Not the romantic version, not the version that would make her pack her bags in a fever of excitement. The real one, the winters that could kill you if you stopped paying attention. The isolation that in certain months felt less like solitude and more like submersion. The physical difficulty of work that didn't stop regardless of weather or weariness or grief. He'd done this because it was the only honest thing to do. And also because he had been afraid, in a way he hadn't examined too closely, of her arriving and finding a gap between the place she'd imagined and the place that actually existed. But she'd kept writing, letter after letter, asking better questions each time. "I want to ask you something," the letter continued, "and I'm going to ask it directly because I find that's the only way I know how to mean things. Why are you alone? Not what happened, necessarily. You don't owe me that. But why are you still alone? Because you're not a man who seems to be missing obvious qualities. You write well. You think clearly. You're honest in a way that I find, and I'm going to say this plainly, uncommon. So I'm curious about the chair, about why it's been empty. You don't have to answer, but I'd like you to." He set the letter down. He sat there for a long time. Outside, the wind started up. It found the gap between the window and its frame the way it always did, a thin, cold thread of air that the house never fully blocked. He could hear it. He'd stopped noticing it mostly, the way you stop noticing things that are always there. He thought about Harold Finch's fingers on his letter. He thought about 47 responses, and 46 of them that felt like forms. He thought about a scratched-out word he still didn't know. He pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer. He dipped the pen. He sat there for a full minute not writing, which was unusual for him. Then he began. "You asked me why I'm still alone. I've thought about how to answer that for 2 days. The most honest version I can give you is this. I never found anyone I could talk to without feeling like I was performing a version of myself I didn't quite recognize. I don't mean that dramatically. I just mean, with most people, there's a kind of translation that happens. You figure out what they need you to be, and you become it. And it's not entirely false, but it's not entirely true either. I've been doing that my whole life, and I'm tired of it. Your first letter is the first time in a long while I didn't feel like I was translating." He paused. "That's why the chair is empty. Not because no one was willing, because I was unwilling to fill it with a translation." He finished the letter. He sealed it. He put it by the door to take to town in the morning, and then he built a fire and ate a cold supper and read until his eyes gave out. And somewhere in the middle of all that, something that had been holding itself rigid in his chest since the morning of Harold Finch's laugh, that hard, sharp thing that was half anger and half humiliation, began quietly to release. Not because the letter fixed anything, not because anything was decided, but because somewhere in Boston there was a woman who had noticed the right word, and she had kept writing. The fire settled into coals. The wind kept talking through the gap in the window. The second chair on the porch sat in the dark, same as always, patient in the way that only objects can be. Silas went to sleep. He did not dream of her exactly. He dreamed of the gap closing in the window frame. Done. In Boston, 3 days later, though Silas wouldn't know this for 2 weeks, the time it took a letter to cross the continent and find its way back, Vivian Hale was standing at the typecase in her father's printing shop when the idea first arrived. It didn't come dramatically. It came the way most ideas that change everything come, sideways, while she was doing something else. She was setting the letters for a dry goods advertisement, finest woolens, reasonable prices, corner of Beacon and Elm. And she was thinking, for the 4th time that morning, about the word she'd scratched out in her 3rd letter. The word had been afraid. She'd written, "I am not afraid of the distance," and then crossed it out because it felt like exactly the kind of sentence a person writes when they are, in fact, afraid of the distance. The letters clicked into the composing stick. Finest woolens. She thought about Nebraska. She thought about 2 chairs on a porch she had never seen. She thought about her father, who was 61, and whose hands shook slightly now in the mornings, who had never said a single unkind thing to her in her entire life, and who needed her in a way that was so quiet and so assumed that neither of them had ever named it directly. She thought about the advertisement she'd read 3 times before she clipped it from the newspaper and folded it into her apron pocket. "I have a porch with 2 chairs. One of them has been waiting longer than I'd like to admit." Reasonable prices. She set the last letter in the stick, looked at the line of type, and thought, "This is how I have spent 14 years. Setting other people's words, in exactly the right order, so that they say exactly what someone else meant." She put the composing stick down. She went to the back of the shop, where the small desk was, and she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. This time she didn't write 4 drafts. She wrote 1. And in it, the part that Silas would read in 2 weeks on a cold Nebraska morning and then have to sit with his hands flat on the table for a moment to steady himself. She wrote, "I think I'd like to see the chair." Vivian's letter arrived on a Wednesday, which was the day Silas usually drove into town for supplies. He almost didn't stop at the post office. The fence on the south pasture had been giving him trouble again, and he had a list in his coat pocket that was longer than the day, and Harold Finch's particular brand of amusement was something he'd been successfully avoiding for 3 weeks. But he stopped. He always stopped now. That was the thing he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet, that he'd reorganized his entire weekly pattern around the possibility of a letter, that the post office had become, against his better judgment, the most important building in Dry Creek. Harold was alone this time, which was marginally better. He handed over the envelope without comment, though the smile was there, compressed into the corners of his mouth, like something he was saving for later. Silas took it without looking at Harold, walked out, climbed back onto the wagon, sat there in the middle of the street with the reins loose in his hands, and opened the letter. He read it. He read the last line again. "I think I'd like to see the chair." He sat there long enough that one of Calloway's hired hands walked past, looked at him, looked away, and kept walking. Silas didn't notice. He was doing something he almost never did. He was trying to figure out what he actually felt, as opposed to what he thought he should feel. What he felt was something close to vertigo. Not panic, not quite. More like the sensation of standing at the edge of something and realizing it was real, that the distance was actual distance, that the drop was an actual drop. He had written an advertisement. He had received letters. He had written back. All of that had existed up to this moment in a kind of protected space. Intimate but theoretical, honest but safe. Words on paper could be folded up and put in a drawer. They didn't arrive at your door. They didn't sit in the second chair. He read the line a 3rd time. "I think I'd like to see the chair." Then he picked up the reins and drove to the feed store and bought what was on his list, and came home and fed the cattle and fixed the south fence and made supper and ate it standing at the kitchen counter because he'd forgotten to sit down, and then he wrote her back. The letter he wrote that night was the most honest thing he'd produced in years. He didn't plan it that way. It came out of him in a single draft, which had never happened before. And when he read it back, he felt exposed in a way that made him want to throw it in the stove. He sent it anyway. First thing in the morning, before he could change his mind. He told her yes. He told her the chair was still empty, and he had no intention of filling it with anything other than the person who was supposed to be in it. He told her the winter was coming faster than usual this year, and the roads would be difficult by November, which was practical information, and also, though he didn't say this, a gentle warning not to wait too long if she was serious. He told her that he'd been thinking about the scratched-out word since her first letter, and that he understood now what it probably was, and that it didn't change anything. That the people worth writing to were usually the ones who were afraid of something. Then, at the end, because he was a man who didn't say unnecessary things, but also didn't leave necessary things unsaid, he wrote, "I want to be clear about what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to come visit. I'm not suggesting an arrangement you can step back from conveniently if the reality doesn't match what you imagined. I'm asking if you want to build the thing I described. Not try it, build it. There's a difference. I think you know that. I think that's why you've been writing drafts." He sent it. Then he waited. That was the part nobody told you about, Silas thought. Not in any of the practical discussions people had about frontier life, about ranching, about the 1,000 daily problems that required your immediate attention. Nobody mentioned that you could be completely occupied, physically exhausted, mentally engaged, constantly needed, and still be waiting. That the waiting didn't require your absence from everything else. It just ran underneath it, a low current, persistent. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The cold arrived ahead of schedule the way it always did, indifferent to what anyone had planned. He started to wonder if he'd miscalculated, if the letter had been too direct, if what she'd meant by, "I think I'd like to see the chair," was something more tentative than he'd read it as. A daydream, not a decision. On the 22nd day, her letter arrived. He opened it standing at the post office counter, which he'd never done before. Harold said something. Silas didn't hear it. Vivian had written, "My father had an episode last Tuesday. His heart. The doctor says it wasn't the worst kind, but he says that carefully, which means it also wasn't nothing. I'm telling you this not as an excuse and not as a farewell. I'm telling you because I've decided you're the person I'm going to be honest with, and the honest truth is that everything I said in my last letter is still true, and everything has also gotten more complicated in the space of 1 week. I haven't changed my mind. I don't know how to leave him right now. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I thought you should know it." Silas folded the letter, put it in his coat, walked out of the post office, stood in the cold for a moment. Then he went home and wrote back. He wrote, "I understand. There's no deadline I'm placing on this. None. What you're describing about your father, that's not complication getting in the way of something real. That's something real. I'd think less of you if you weren't feeling it." He paused, then added, "I'm not going anywhere. The chair isn't either." That letter crossed a line they hadn't previously crossed, the line between two people conducting a careful, exploratory correspondence and two people who had, without formally deciding to, begun to depend on each other in small but irreversible ways. He didn't fully realize that until a week passed without a letter, and he found himself, on the 8th day, standing in the barn with a perfectly functional task in front of him and an inability to focus on it that had no practical explanation. He was worried about her, not about what she would decide, about her father's hands shaking, about a woman who had spent 14 years setting other people's words standing in a print shop that smelled like ink and metal and familiar limitation, holding a decision in her chest that nobody around her probably even knew was there. He wrote her a different kind of letter that week, not about himself, not about the ranch or the chair or the practicalities of what they were discussing. He just asked her questions. What was her father's name? What had it been like growing up in a print shop? What did she read when she got to choose? What was the view from that window, exactly? What street? What time of day did she usually look out of it? He almost didn't send it. It felt presumptuous. Too close. He sent it anyway. Her response came back in 10 days, and it was 7 pages, which was the longest she'd ever written, and she answered every question with a thoroughness that told him she'd been wanting someone to ask for a long time. Her father's name was Edmund Hale. He'd started the shop with $40 and a borrowed press when Vivian was 3 years old. He was stubborn and particular about punctuation and had taught her to read using the type cases. She'd learned her alphabet not from books, but from the lead letters themselves, holding each one up to the light to see it reversed in her hand. He made terrible coffee and excellent pie, and had never in her life told her she couldn't do something, but had also never once suggested she might want to do something other than what she was already doing. It wasn't unkindness, she wrote. I want to be fair to him. I think he just never imagined I might want a different life. And neither did I, for a long time. The view from the window was a cobblestone street, Beacon, near the corner where the elm tree had died 2 winters ago and hadn't been replaced. She usually looked out around 2 in the afternoon, which was when the light came at an angle that made the stones look briefly like something from another century. She read everything she could get her hands on, novels mostly, but also newspapers, pamphlets, the scientific journals that came through the shop for printing and that she read in sections between work, standing at the press. She had opinions about Darwin that she'd never been able to share with anyone who found them interesting. She had opinions about a lot of things, she said, with a wryness that came through even in writing. You may have already noticed that. Silas read those 7 pages twice. Then he did something unusual. He laughed. Alone in his kitchen, with the stove ticking and the wind at the window and nobody around for half a mile in any direction. A real laugh, the kind that catches you off guard because it comes from something genuine. He hadn't done that in longer than he could precisely name. He wrote back about Darwin. He had opinions too. More than she'd expect from a rancher in Nebraska, she'd implied, and he addressed that directly. You're assuming I haven't read him. I have. Twice. I also have opinions about the parts the scientific journals don't argue about enough. He told her about the university extension library in the county seat, 40 miles away, and how he'd been borrowing books from it since he was 19. He told her about this winter he'd been snowbound for 11 days and had read his way through an entire crate of someone else's discarded library. History, philosophy, 2 novels in French that he'd worked through with a borrowed dictionary, and a determination that had surprised even himself. He told her about the night he'd decided to build the house. Not the official version, not the practical frontier-minded version he gave when anyone in town had the nerve to ask. The real version. He'd been sitting on the land he'd just bought in the early dark of a March evening, and the silence had been so complete it had a texture, and he'd thought, I could live the rest of my life inside this silence, and it would be enough for most people. And then he'd thought, but I'm not most people. And then he'd thought for the first time, with a clarity that startled him, I don't want to be alone. Not I want a wife, not I need help. Just, I don't want to be alone. He wrote that to her and then sat looking at it on the page for several minutes. He'd never said that out loud to anyone. He sent the letter. The rhythm of their correspondence had changed, by this point, in ways that were hard to name precisely, but impossible to miss. The letters came faster. They were longer. They had stopped being careful in the way first letters are careful, structured, considered, presenting the best and most plausible version of yourself. They had become something else, something messier and more accurate. She wrote to him about an argument she'd had with her father about the shop's accounts, and how she'd been right and known she was right, and still felt guilty for the rest of the day. He wrote to her about a hired hand he'd let go the previous spring for drinking on the job, a man with a family, and how he still wasn't sure he'd made the right call, even though he'd had no reasonable choice. She told him about the apprentice she'd been training, a 17-year-old named Thomas Greer, the son of a local blacksmith who had a gift for the work that she found, in unguarded moments, slightly painful to watch because it reminded her of herself at that age, before she'd stopped noticing it as a gift and started treating it as just a job. That detail, the way she'd written about Thomas Greer, lodged in Silas's mind in a particular way. He thought about it for days afterward, the way she'd described watching someone else inhabit the work she'd given years to, and feeling not resentment exactly, but something more complicated, recognition, maybe, of what she'd been, of what she'd slowly stopped being. He wrote back, "That's not a small thing what you said about the boy. I think you know that." She replied, "I know. I've been thinking about it since I wrote it. He's better than I was at his age, I think, or at least he still knows he loves it. I'm not sure I know that anymore. About the shop, I mean. Then 4 lines down, as if she were changing the subject but wasn't, my father's hands are steadier this week. The doctor is cautiously optimistic. I don't entirely trust cautiously optimistic, but I'm trying. Silas read that paragraph and felt something shift in the correspondence. A change in pressure, subtle but real. She was circling something, not quite ready to land on it yet, but circling. The following letter confirmed it. It was shorter than her recent ones, denser. She'd clearly rewritten it several times because the handwriting changed slightly between paragraphs in the way that only happens when you've set a page down and come back to it after time has passed and your hand has cooled. She wrote, "I've been thinking about what it would mean, not in a romantic way, or not only in a romantic way. Practically. My father has the shop. Thomas is good and getting better. The business wouldn't fail without me. I've been pretending that wasn't true because it was convenient to pretend, and I think you've given me enough honesty in these letters that I owe you the same in return. The truth is, I've been necessary and I've also been hiding, both things, at once. Then, I don't know what to do about my father, not the shop. I can solve the shop. My father." Silas read that line and understood immediately what she wasn't saying. Not can I leave the business. Can I leave him? Can I be the person who chose something for herself when he's the reason she knows how to choose at all? He thought carefully before he wrote back. He knew the wrong response here would not be a mistake. It would be a revelation of a kind he couldn't recover from. If he said the practical thing, the reasonable thing, the let's solve this problem thing, she would receive it correctly as the answer of a man who did not fully understand what she was telling him. And she would be right. He wrote, "You're not asking me what to do. I know that. So I'm not going to tell you. What I'll tell you is what I know about my father, who is not a bad man and not a good one, but someone I loved in spite of the places where he failed me, and who I still think about on certain mornings with something that isn't grief exactly, but is close enough that I've stopped trying to name the difference. You can love someone completely and still need something they can't give you. Those two things don't cancel each other out. I've been a long time learning that." He sealed the letter. He stepped outside. The sky over the plains was doing something enormous and indifferent, the way it did in November, gray and huge and pressing down. The second chair was on the porch. He'd moved it inside twice during bad weather and then put it back each time, which was something he only admitted to himself in the vaguest possible terms. He looked at the chair. He thought about a woman in Boston, standing at a window at 2 p.m. when the light came at an angle, looking out at a dead elm tree. 60 days passed. They were not silent days. Letters kept coming, kept crossing each other in transit, the correspondence maintaining its rhythm, even as the thing underneath the rhythm grew more charged and more difficult. But they were 60 days in which nothing was resolved, and Silas felt the weight of the unresolved thing, in a way that was new to him. He was a patient man. He'd learned patience the way you learn it on the frontier, which is that it isn't a virtue so much as a survival requirement. But this was a different kind of waiting. This had a quality of suspension to it, like a hinge holding 2 heavy doors. Then, on a Thursday in late January, when the cold had reached the kind of depth that made every surface in the house contract slightly overnight so that you woke to the sounds of small structural complaints, a letter arrived that was different from all the ones before it. Not because of what it said exactly, because of what it didn't say. It was 2 paragraphs, the shortest she'd sent since the first. Thomas passed his 3-month mark last week. He closed the shop alone twice, set the weekly edition without me checking it, and caught an error in a client's copy that I would have caught, but that he caught first. My father watched him do it, and afterward he told me, and I'm going to write this exactly as he said it. That boy reminds me of you at that age. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. But we both understood what he meant. Then, I've been looking at train schedules. Silas read those 5 words at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning in January, with his coffee going cold beside him, and the stove burning and the wind doing its usual thing at the window. He put the letter down. He pressed both hands flat on the table, the way he'd thought about doing months ago after a different letter. He sat there for a long time, not reading, not thinking particularly in any organized way, just there, present in the kitchen, present in the house, aware of it around him in a way that was different from usual, that had a shape to it, a before and after quality. Then he stood up. He went to the porch. He looked at the second chair, sitting there with November's ice long gone and January's cold in its place, the wood slightly rougher than the other chair from a season of weather. He went back inside. He picked up his pen. He wrote back 2 sentences. After months of letters, long ones, careful ones, honest ones that had cost him more than he usually admitted things cost him. 2 sentences. Tell me which train. I'll be at the station. Outside, the planes went on in every direction, wide and cold and completely indifferent to what was happening inside the small house at the edge of them, where a man had just set down his pen and looked up at the ceiling and breathed once, slowly, the way you breathe when something has finally become real. The second chair waited. The winter held. And in Boston, 3 days later, a woman who had been setting other people's words into careful and perfect order for the better part of her adult life sat down with a piece of paper. Not a fresh sheet this time, not a clean start, but the back of a train schedule she'd already folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft, and wrote back. 1 line. She told him the date. The date she gave him was March the 4th. He wrote it on a scrap of paper and put it in his shirt pocket, which was not something he normally did with anything. He was a man who kept things in his head, lists, dates, the particular inventory of his own life. Writing the date down was an admission that he didn't trust himself to hold it carefully enough in memory alone, and he knew that, and he put the paper in his pocket anyway. March 4th was 41 days away. He counted them. Not obsessively. Not the way a man counts days when he has nothing else to think about. He counted them the way you check a compass when you're crossing ground you know well but haven't crossed in a while, just to confirm the direction. The days were full. January and February on a Nebraska cattle operation left no room for distraction, which was the one mercy the season offered. The cold that had settled in before Christmas had deepened into something structural. Not weather anymore, but a condition, a permanent quality of the air that you stopped expecting to lift and simply incorporated into everything you did. He broke ice from the water troughs every morning before the animals could drink. He reinforced the barn's north wall against a wind that had found a weakness he'd missed in the fall. He lost 1 steer to the cold in early February, not to the cold directly, but to a weakness the cold had found, and spent an evening feeling worse about it than the economics of the thing warranted, which was something he didn't examine too closely. He wrote to Vivian twice more before March, not about the date, not about logistics. He wrote because the correspondence had become, without his full permission, necessary. The thing at the end of the day that he reached for in the same way other men reached for a drink or a pipe. A way of processing the day through the filter of a person who had shown him, letter by letter, that she was capable of understanding what he said without him having to sand the edges off of it first. She wrote back about the preparations she was making. She was practical about it. She listed things with the precision of someone who'd spent decades managing inventory, the books she was bringing and the ones she was leaving, the tools of her trade she thought might be useful, and the ones that belonged to her father's shop and were staying with it. She wrote about the conversation she'd had with Thomas Greer, who had taken the news with a maturity that had surprised her, and then, the following day, asked her 3 technical questions about account management that told her he'd been thinking about it all night. She wrote about that with something she called pride, and something underneath the pride that she didn't name, but that Silas read as grief, the specific grief of being replaced by the person you chose to replace you. She did not write about the conversation with her father. He noticed that absence. He didn't mention it. The last letter she sent before March arrived 8 days early, which meant she'd written it almost immediately after receiving his second February letter, and the speed of it told him something she hadn't said directly. The letter was short and not particularly organized, which was unusual for her. She typically wrote with a compositor's precision, each paragraph earning its place. This one had a quality of having been written in pieces, at different sittings, with different qualities of attention. Some of it was calm, some of it was not. She wrote, "I told my father last night. Not everything, not the letters, not the full amount of it, just that I was going. That I'd found a situation in Nebraska that I believed in, and that Thomas was ready, and that I needed to do this." He sat there for a long time without saying anything. My father has never been a quiet man. He has opinions about typesetting, about weather, about the correct way to make pie crust, about everything. And his silence was the loudest thing I've heard in years. Then, he asked me one question. He asked if I was certain, and I told him yes. And he nodded, and he said, "And I'm writing this exactly. Then I suppose you'd better go." He got up and went to bed. I sat at the kitchen table until midnight, then, in smaller handwriting, as if she'd written it quickly before she could decide not to. I don't know if I did the right thing. I think I did. I know I have to. Those feel like 3 different statements, and they might all be true. Silas read that sitting on the edge of his bed at 11 o'clock at night, after a day that had started at 4 in the morning and had not been easy. He read it twice. He thought about Edmund Hale, a man he knew entirely through his daughter's letters, which meant he knew him the way you know a country through the account of someone who grew up there, which is a specific and partial and somewhat more truthful kind of knowing than the official version. He thought about a man who'd taught his daughter the alphabet from lead type and never suggested she might want a different life, and who, when it came to it, had said 4 words and gone to bed. He wrote back, "He let you go." That's what that was. Some men do it loudly, and some men do it with 4 words and a closed door, and both of them mean the same thing. He let you go. He sealed that letter and went to sleep, and 2 weeks later, March arrived. The 4th was a Sunday. Silas drove to the county seat, not Dry Creek, where the local station handled only freight with any reliability, on a road that was still half frozen in the ruts of previous weeks. The wagon handled it badly, and so did he. He'd been up since 3, which was earlier than necessary, and had spent the extra hours doing nothing particularly useful, which was unlike him. He'd also cut his hair, not at a barber. He hadn't wanted to sit in a barber's chair in the county seat and have the conversation that would inevitably follow about where he was going and why. He'd done it himself, with a hand mirror propped on the kitchen windowsill and his good scissors, and the result was adequate. He knew it was adequate. He'd looked at it a long time in the mirror, which was also unlike him. The station at Millard County was not a grand building. It was a plank platform and a small heated waiting room with 3 benches and a schedule board that was almost never fully accurate. He arrived an hour early. He sat on one of the benches. He was the only person there for 40 minutes, and then a farmer came through with a crate of something live that made noise, and then 2 women with luggage who spoke to each other in low voices and didn't acknowledge him, and then the station master came out and said the westbound was running about 20 minutes late, which was better than usual. Silas stood up. He walked to the end of the platform. He looked down the tracks, which disappeared into a low gray horizon that told him nothing. He thought about the thing he hadn't let himself think about for the past 6 weeks. The thing beneath all the practicalities, beneath the date on the scrap of paper, beneath the letters, beneath the 2 chairs and the house, and the advertisement that Harold Finch had found so amusing. The simple, unglamorous, slightly terrifying fact. He had never met this woman. They had exchanged 11 letters each way, which was more genuine conversation than he'd had with most people he'd known for years. And he had formed, through those letters, an understanding of her that felt more precise than most of what he knew about the people around him. But she had a face he'd never seen, a voice he'd never heard, a way of existing in physical space, a way of walking into a room, or going quiet when she was thinking, or laughing, or being wrong about something, that was entirely unknown to him. He thought, what if I've been wrong about all of it? Not wrong about her exactly. Wrong about his own capacity to translate what he knew of her on paper into what she was going to be standing on a station platform. Wrong about the gap between the person you understand through words and the person who shows up. He'd been standing at the end of the platform for 12 minutes, having thoughts that were not helpful, when the train appeared on the horizon. He heard it before he saw it, the sound traveling across the flatland ahead of the machine, and he turned and watched it come, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, I am either about to understand something, or I am about to discover what I misunderstood. The train slowed, the brakes, the steam, the whole enormous clattering process of something large coming to rest. He watched the doors. People came down in 1s and 2s. The farmer with the crate had moved toward the freight car at the rear. The station master was consulting his board. A man in a city suit stepped down and immediately looked lost. A woman with a child who was already complaining about something. An elderly man moving carefully with a cane. Then, from the third car, a woman stepped down carrying a single suitcase that she managed without help, though the step was higher than expected and she came down it slightly harder than she'd intended. She caught herself. She straightened. She looked up at the platform and then looked directly at him, the way you look at the one person who's clearly there to meet someone, and she did not smile immediately. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not nervous exactly, but alert, that was the word for it. Alert in the way of someone gathering information quickly. She was not what he'd pictured. He wasn't sure what he'd pictured. She was medium height, brown-haired, with ink stains on her right hand that she'd clearly tried to scrub out and hadn't entirely succeeded, and she had the kind of face that didn't offer itself all at once, but that you could see would be very readable once you knew it. He walked toward her. She walked toward him. They met in the middle of the platform in the slightly absurd way of two people who've been trying to locate each other in a crowd. Except there was no crowd. He said, "Miss Hale." She said, "You got a haircut." He stopped. She looked at him with that alert expression, and then something shifted in it. The smallest possible rearrangement, and he understood she was trying not to smile. "I did," he said. "It's uneven on the left," she said. "I'm sorry, I noticed things like that. Occupational habit. I cut it myself." "That explains it." She looked at him another moment. "You're taller than I expected." "You're shorter." She did smile then, but briefly, and there was something complicated underneath the smile that was not quite amusement and not quite nervousness. Something more like reckoning. He understood it because he was doing the same thing, processing the gap between the person he'd known in letters and the person standing in front of him, and finding that the gap wasn't what he'd feared. It wasn't a disappointment. It was more like translation, the same thing in a different language, still requiring work, but recognizable. He said, "Are you hungry? There's a place near here that's decent." She said, "I haven't eaten since Missouri." "That was a long time ago." "Yes," she said, "it was." He took her suitcase, which she allowed after a brief pause that told him she'd considered not allowing it. They walked off the platform. He put the suitcase in the wagon, and she looked at the wagon without comment, though he noticed her take in its condition and the horse and the particular quality of mud on the wheels. He'd cleaned it before he left, and it had acquired new mud on the drive in. He felt, briefly and without reason, self-conscious about this. Then he decided that was ridiculous. They ate at the place he'd mentioned, a small establishment that served food without much ambition but with reasonable accuracy, which was what the situation called for. She ordered coffee and eggs and ate with a directness that he found, unexpectedly, a relief. He'd half expected the occasion to create a kind of performance in both of them, a careful display of best manners, and instead she just ate because she was hungry and asked the server for more coffee when she finished the first, and looked at him across the table with that reading expression that he was already beginning to recognize as her default state. She said, "Tell me something you didn't tell me in the letters." He thought about it seriously. "I have a dog," he said. "His name is Pocket. He's old and he smells bad, and I didn't mention him because I thought you'd make assumptions about my domestic arrangements." She considered this. "What kind of assumptions?" "The kind that turn out to be accurate." She looked at him. "What are his good qualities?" "He's honest," Silas said. "He doesn't pretend to like things he doesn't like. Most dogs perform for you. Pocket doesn't bother." "I already like him," she said. That was when the first real ease came into the conversation. Not the constructed ease of two people trying, but the accidental ease of two people who have momentarily stopped managing the situation and let it be what it is. It didn't last long. There was too much unresolved for ease to hold for more than a few minutes. But it was there, and he registered it. She said, "I need to tell you something." Her voice changed on that sentence in a way that rearranged his attention completely. Not louder, just more deliberate. He said, "All right." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked at it, not at him, which was the first time she'd broken eye contact since the platform. She said, "My father received an offer for the shop. For the building and the business and the equipment, all of it. A printing company from Philadelphia. The offer came in September. September, he calculated quietly. September was 2 months into their correspondence. 3 months before she'd told him about her father's heart episode. 4 months before she'd mentioned the train schedules. He didn't accept it, she said. He told me about it in October, after his episode. He said he'd been holding it because he didn't want me to think his illness was forcing the decision. He wanted me to know the decision was separate. She paused. I didn't tell you. In the letters. I should have, and I didn't. And I've been deciding every week whether to say something, and every week I let another letter go out without it. She looked up at him now. The alertness in her face had sharpened into something more exposed. I wasn't hiding it to manipulate anything, she said. I want to be clear about that. I was hiding it because I didn't want you to think that I was coming because the situation had resolved itself and made it convenient. I wanted you to know I was choosing this, not just taking the available exit. Silas looked at her. He thought about the weeks she'd described of conflict and impossible balance, her father's health, the apprentice, the letters coming and going across 2,000 miles of continent. He thought about September and October, and the months between then and now. He thought about what it had cost her to carry that, and then say it directly, on the first day, in a diner with bad coffee, before she'd even seen the house. He said, "Why are you telling me now?" She said, "Because I'm not starting this with something I know and you don't. I told you months ago you were the person I was going to be honest with. I meant it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your timing was your business. The offer, your father, Thomas, none of that was mine to have an opinion about. You handled your situation. You got on a train." He paused. "The honesty is what matters." She looked at him steadily. "You're not angry?" "No. Most people would be." "I'm not most people," he said. "You knew that." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face did something he wouldn't be able to describe accurately until much later. Something that was not quite relief and not quite recognition, but was somewhere between them. The expression of someone who had been prepared for a reaction that didn't come, and didn't quite know yet what to do with its absence. She said quietly, "No, I did know that." The drive back to Dry Creek took 2.5 hours. The road was rough in the way February always left roads rough, and the sky had been doing something uncertain since mid-afternoon that resolved around mile 8 into light snow. Nothing serious. Just the kind of snow that makes the world slightly quieter and slightly more itself. She didn't talk for the first half hour. He didn't either. He'd been a long time learning that silence between people was a diagnostic, that what it meant depended entirely on its quality, and that the uncomfortable kind and the easy kind were very different animals. This silence was not comfortable exactly, but it wasn't strained. It was the silence of two people processing, and he respected that. She asked around mile 12, "Does the whole town know I'm coming?" He kept his eyes on the road. Dry Creek is a small place. "So, yes." "There's a man named Harold Finch," he said. "He's the postmaster. He has opinions about most things." "And about me specifically?" "He's been following the correspondence with interest." She turned to look at him. "He read our letters?" He held them up to the light. He paused. He didn't read them. He just made his position on them clear. She was quiet for a moment. "What's his position?" "That a Boston woman coming to Nebraska is likely to last until the first hard frost." She turned back to face the road. He watched her from the side and saw the particular set of her jaw that he would come to know well, a tightening at the corners that wasn't anger so much as decision. She said, "When did the last frost end?" "About 3 weeks ago." "Then I'm already late," she said. "I suppose I'd better get started." He said nothing, but something in his chest did the thing it had been doing since September, since the letters, since the scratched-out word he'd spent months trying to read through the page. It did it more clearly now, and more certainly, and he recognized it for what it was without trying to rename it into something less consequential. The house appeared on the horizon as they crested the last low rise before his land, the way it always did. Small against the plains, specific against the enormous vague sky. The west-facing porch was not visible from this angle. The second chair was not visible. She saw it. She didn't say anything. He watched her see it. Then she said very quietly, "You built that?" "Yes, with 2 chairs." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved toward it. The snow continued its mild and non-committal falling. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said. "Most things are." "That's not a complaint." She looked at it steadily as they approached. "I'm trying to tell you it's real. That it looks real. It looks like a house where things happen. Not a picture of a house." He pulled the horse up in front. He got down. He came around and she was already stepping down, not waiting, managing it without the high step from the train car. She stood in front of the house and looked at it, and then she looked at the porch, and she saw the chairs. He came to stand beside her, not close, just beside her. She looked at the 2 chairs for a long time. She said finally, "I spent months imagining what I would say when I saw it." He said, "What did you imagine?" She said, "Something better than this." A pause. "I don't have anything prepared. I thought I would. I thought I'd know what to say." She turned to look at him. "I think I've used everything I had in the letters." He looked back at her. "That's all right," he said. "So have I." They stood there for a moment, in front of the house in the light snow, with the planes going in all directions and the 2 chairs on the porch and a dog somewhere inside who smelled bad and had honest opinions about everything, and the whole enormous fact of it, the letters, the months, the distance, the scratched-out word, the train, the coffee in Millard County, the things she'd told him, and the way he'd received it, all of it present at once in the particular way that significant moments are, which is without fanfare, without music, with a specific and anticlimactic realness of things that are actually happening as opposed to things being imagined. She said, "I'd like to see the inside." He said, "All right." He opened the door. She walked through it. He followed. The house received them both without ceremony, which was exactly right. The first morning was the hardest, not because anything went wrong exactly, because nothing went wrong in the way that both of them had quietly braced for, and the absence of immediate disaster left a strange, exposed quality to the day, like a room with too much light. Vivian woke before him. He heard her moving in the kitchen, the particular sound of someone unfamiliar with a space trying to be quiet about their unfamiliarity, the careful opening of cabinet doors, the hesitation before the stove. He lay in his room and listened to it and thought about the fact that a person was in his kitchen who had not been in it yesterday and would be in it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and he understood in a new and fully physical way what he had been abstractly agreeing to for the past 6 months. He got up. She was standing at the stove with her back to him, and she had found the coffee and had managed the stove correctly, which he noted. She was still in her traveling clothes from yesterday. Her hair was down, which was different from anything he'd imagined, which was that he hadn't imagined it at all. She heard him come in and turned around. She had that alert look, the one from the platform, the one he was beginning to understand was her face in any situation where the terms weren't fully established yet. She said, "The stove runs hot on the left side." "I know," he said. "I meant to fix that." "When?" "About 3 years ago." She looked at him without expression for a moment and then handed him a cup of coffee, and that was that. They drank it at the kitchen table, and outside the light was doing what March light did in Nebraska, arriving flat and pale and without warmth, and Pocket was at the door asking to be let in, which Silas did, and the dog came in and went directly to Vivian and smelled her boots with the thoroughness of a customs officer. She looked down at him. "This is Pocket." "Yes." "He's enormous." "He's a big dog." "You said he was old." "He is old. He was a big young dog first." Pocket finished his investigation of her boots and went to his corner and lay down with the particular sigh of an animal who has completed a task. Vivian watched him do it. "He approved," Silas said. "I noticed," she said. "I'm choosing to be flattered." They were careful with each other that first week in the way that's not quite politeness and not quite distance, but somewhere in between, a kind of deliberate considerateness, each of them learning the other's rhythms without commenting on them directly. She woke early. He woke earlier. She was quiet in the mornings and more herself by mid-afternoon. He was the reverse, sharpest before noon, quieter as the day went on. She had opinions about where things should be kept and mostly kept them to herself unless asked. He asked eventually about the coffee cups, because she'd moved them twice. She said, "They were too far from the stove." He said, "I always got them before I lit the stove." She considered this. "That seems inefficient." "It's what I was used to." She looked at him. He looked at her. She moved the cups back to where they'd been, but in a slightly different position that was, he had to admit, marginally more logical than either of the previous two. And he didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. And somehow that was the first real negotiation of the house, and they both knew it without naming it. The harder adjustments were the ones that didn't have simple solutions. She had come from a world of precision, compositing type, where a letter out of place ruined the entire line, where the work required a specific and absolute kind of attention. The ranch operated on different principles. Things broke. Plans changed because the weather changed, or an animal changed them. What worked yesterday didn't always work today. She understood this intellectually and struggled with it practically, and it showed in the first weeks in ways she was too honest to hide. The third day, she tried to help with the morning feeding. He'd shown her the basic sequence: hay first, water after. The south pen gets an extra measure because those animals were smaller. She did it correctly and came back inside covered in feed dust and said, "I dropped the entire measure into the trough instead of over it." He said, "Was the water in it yet?" "No." "Then it's fine. The animals will eat it either way." She looked at her hands. There was a small cut on her palm from the latch on the pen gate, which was older than it should be and caught unexpectedly. It was minor. She was not a woman who made much of minor, but he said, "That gate, I'll fix it today." She looked at him. "You don't have to do it today." "I should have done it before you got here," he said. "It's been on my list." She opened her mouth and then closed it, and he understood she'd been about to say something self-sufficient and had decided not to, which was its own kind of progress. He fixed the gate that afternoon. She watched him do part of it, not because he needed watching, but because she was learning. He could tell by the quality of her attention, which was the same quality it had in her letters, that concentrated and slightly unsentimental interest in how things actually worked. She said, while he was replacing the pin on the latch, "You do everything yourself." "Mostly." "Do you ever ask for help?" He thought about it honestly. "When there's no other option." "Is that practical or is that something else?" He looked up at her. "Probably something else." She nodded, the way she nodded when she was filing something away. "I'll tell you when I notice it being a problem," she said. "I'd expect nothing less," he said. The first real fight happened in the second week. It started over the accounts, which she'd asked to look at, and which he'd handed over without particular concern because he kept them honestly, if not elegantly. She sat with them for 2 hours one evening while he worked on the harness repair he'd been putting off, and when she came out to the barn where he was working, her expression had the particular quality of someone who has found something they didn't want to find. She said, "You've been paying Callaway twice for the shared water access." He looked up from the harness. "That's not possible." "I know it seems that way," she said, "but it is, since 1885. There's the original agreement, and then there's a separate line in the quarterly that lists it again under a different name. Either you've been doing it in error, or Callaway has been letting you do it in error, which amounts to the same thing practically, but is very different in other ways." He put the harness down. He thought about Deke Callaway, who had been at the post office with Harold Finch on the morning of the first letter, who had said, loud enough to carry, that you couldn't order a wife like seed corn. He said, "How much?" She's told him. He was quiet for a moment. The number wasn't devastating. It was significant. He said, "I need to go talk to Callaway." She said, "I know. I wanted to tell you before you saw it yourself." A pause. "I also want to say, I'm not telling you this to demonstrate something. I'm telling you because it's your money and it's wrong and you should have it back." He looked at her in the lamplight of the barn, this woman who had been in his house for 12 days and had already found a 2-year error in his accounts, and was explaining her motives for telling him about it. And he thought, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes in moments you haven't prepared for, She's exactly who she was in the letters. Exactly. He went to see Calloway the next morning. Calloway's response, when confronted with the specific figures Vivian had laid out, was not to deny it, but to suggest it had been an honest mistake on both sides. He was a big man, Calloway, with the easy manner of someone accustomed to being given the benefit of the doubt in his own community. He said he'd be happy to work something out. He said these things happen. He said it in the particular way of a man who had been caught and was calculating how much goodwill the admission could purchase. Silas said, "I'd like the amount returned, in full, within 30 days. Calloway looked at him. "Now that's a hard line, Silas." "It's a fair line," Silas said. "I'd say the same to anyone." He came home and told Vivian what had happened, and she listened carefully and then said, "He'll pay it." "How do you know?" "Because you didn't leave him room to turn it into something complicated," she said. "Men like that, they need the argument more than the money. You didn't give him the argument." Calloway paid within 3 weeks. He did it by dropping off a sealed envelope at the house with no accompanying note, which Silas found on the porch one morning and brought inside without comment. He set it on the table. Vivian counted it. The amount was correct. She said, "He rounded up." Silas said, "I noticed. Interesting." "He's telling me something." "That he wants you not to talk about it," she said. "Yes." She looked at the money. "Are you going to?" "Not unless he gives me a reason to." She nodded. She put the money in the accounts box with a particular precision that was, he had come to understand, the physical expression of her thinking. When she organized things, she was also organizing her thoughts about them. The money went back into the operation, and the operation, under her attention, began to change in ways that were gradual and then suddenly visible. It wasn't that Silas had been running things badly. He hadn't. He was competent and careful and had built a functional operation from open land in 5 years, but he'd been doing it alone, and there are things you don't see when you're the only one looking. She saw them. She saw the supplier he was overpaying for seed because he'd always used the same man and had never run the comparison. She saw the pattern in the cattle weights that suggested the south pasture wasn't as productive as it looked, not failing, just underperforming, and a rotation adjustment could address it. She saw the quarter of the ranch where the fencing was showing its age before it had failed, which meant it could be addressed on their timeline rather than the fences. She brought these things to him one at a time, not all at once, not as a list of his failures, but as conversations, as the same kind of direct and interested engagement that the letters had been. He listened. He pushed back when he disagreed, and she held her ground when she was right and conceded when she was wrong and was not graceful about conceding, but did it anyway, which he respected more than Grace would have been. She was not wrong often. What she found harder and what showed in the first months in ways that neither of them handled perfectly was the isolation. She'd known it intellectually. He'd described it in the first letters, carefully, without dramatizing it. But there was a gap between understanding isolation and living inside it, and she hit that gap about 3 weeks in, and it was rougher than she'd let on. He noticed it not because she said anything, but because the quality of her evenings changed. She'd been reading. She'd brought 4 books and was working through them. And then one week she read the same 40 pages twice, which he knew because he'd seen where her bookmark was. And she stopped bringing up the articles she'd been mentally composing about the cattle operations bookkeeping systems, which had been a small running conversation they'd been having for days. He said, one evening, "You can write to your father." She looked up. "I know. I mean regularly. You don't have to ration it." She was quiet for a moment. "I've written twice. He wrote back once. He's not a natural letter writer." "What did he say?" She picked up her book, which meant she was about to either answer or not. He said the shop was doing well, and Thomas had set the Thursday edition with no errors, and the pie he'd made that week hadn't been as good as usual because he'd rushed the crust. Silas said nothing. She said, "He didn't ask how I was." "That's not the same as not wondering." She looked at him over the book. "I know that," she said, and her voice had an edge that was not directed at him but landed near him anyway, and he let it land. After a moment she said, "I'm fine. I knew it was going to be this. I I knew it in the way you know something before you've lived it. Yes, he said. She looked at him steadily. Does it get easier? He thought about his own first winter on the land alone, 19 years old, with the silence pressing down from all sides. He thought about the way he'd learned to make the silence into something workable rather than something to fight. Not easier, he said. Different. You stop measuring it against the other thing. She considered this. That's not particularly comforting. No, he said. It isn't. But it's accurate. She went back to her book. He went back to his harness work. The stove ticked. Pocket shifted in his corner. Outside, the planes were doing what they always did, which was everything and nothing all at once. That night, after he'd gone to bed, he heard her at the desk in the front room. The particular sound of pen on paper, fast, which was different from her letter-writing pace. He didn't know what she was writing. He didn't ask in the morning. 2 weeks later, she showed him. It was 8 pages, handwritten, dense. A detailed account of the cattle operation's financial structure, including the Callaway error, the supplier comparison, the pasture rotation analysis, and 3 suggestions for the next season's approach. Written not as a letter, not as an informal note, but as a document. The kind of thing that could be printed, distributed, referenced. He read it slowly. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and did not perform patience, but actually had it, which he'd come to understand was one of the real differences. He said, "This is good." "I know," she said, without embarrassment, "but that's not what I want to talk about." She leaned forward slightly. "There are other ranches around here with the same problems. The Hendersons, the Pruitt family, probably 2 or 3 others I've heard mentioned. Nobody's talking to anybody else. Everyone's making the same errors in isolation." He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that there's a use for a printing press in Dry Creek." He put the pages down. She said, "Not right away. I know that. I'm not trying to rebuild Boston in Nebraska, but there's something missing out here that I know how to provide. Information, practical, specific, useful information that these families don't have access to because they're too far apart and too busy to find it themselves." He sat with this. He thought about the isolation she'd described, about the 8 pages she'd written in the dark while he slept, about a woman who had spent 14 years setting other people's words and had, somewhere in the process, accumulated a great many of her own. He said, "You'd need equipment." "Yes." "That costs money." "I know what it costs," she said. "I've been pricing press equipment since I was 15. He looked at her. She looked back. He said, "Let me think about it." "That's all I'm asking," she said. She was asking for more than that, and they both knew it. She was asking in the particular way that she asked for things, directly, without performance, but also without full exposure of what it would mean to her if the answer was no, for permission to be more than a rancher's wife who balanced the books. She was asking if there was room, in this life they were building, for the particular person she actually was. He thought about it for 3 days. He did not think about the money, which was a real constraint but a solvable one. He thought about what it would mean to the operation, to their dynamic, to the way Dry Creek would receive it. He thought about Harold Finch. He thought about Callaway's sealed envelope with no note. On the 3rd day, he came in from the south pasture, and she was at the desk, not writing, just sitting with her hands around a cup of coffee and looking at the wall in the particular way of someone who is not thinking about the wall. He said, "I think you should do it." She turned around. He said, "I don't know if Dry Creek is ready for it. I don't know if you'll find enough to write about. I don't know if the equipment will hold in this climate or where exactly we'll put it, but I think you should do it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" "Because you wrote 8 pages about cattle accounting at midnight, and they were the best argued 8 pages I've read in a decade," he said. "And because you were right about the gap. There's something missing out here. I just never had the word for it before." She set down the coffee. She said, "We'd need to build onto the back of the house." "I figured. And I'd need to contact suppliers in Omaha. I can drive you to the telegraph office." She was quiet for a moment. Not emotional, exactly, or not in any outward way. But there was something happening in her face, a settling, the way a tightly held thing settles when it's finally been set down somewhere real. She said, This is going to be harder than either of us expects. Most things are. And you're still saying yes. I'm still saying yes. She nodded. She picked up her pen. He went to wash his hands before dinner, and in the kitchen behind him he could hear the particular sound of her writing. Fast, purposeful, already beginning. The worst night came in late November. He'd been out since noon checking the North Herd, which had been moving wrong for 2 days in a way that usually meant either a predator problem or a water issue. He'd found neither, but had spent 3 hours in the kind of cold that had dropped in fast and unexpected, the temperature falling 15 degrees between his setting out and his trying to get back, and the wind doing what November wind in Nebraska does, which is treat every structure as a suggestion. He'd fixed the barn door. It had blown open in the gust and the latch needed emergency attention, or he'd lose heat he couldn't afford to lose. And he'd done it in the dark with hands that had stopped cooperating properly. And he'd worked longer than he should have because the job needed finishing, and he'd always finish jobs. When he finally came inside, she was at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up, and she looked at his hands. She said, "Sit down." He said, "I'm fine." She said, "Silas, sit down." He sat down. She brought a basin of water, not hot, lukewarm, which was correct, which told him she'd read something about cold at some point in her life because most people's instinct was wrong. And she put his hands in it and sat across from him and waited. He said, "I told you I was fine." "Your left hand was white to the wrist," she said. "That's not fine." He looked at the basin. The water was doing its work. His hands began to report back in the unpleasant way they did when circulation returned. She said, "How long were you out there?" "Since noon." "It's past 9. "I know what time it is." She looked at him with an expression he'd seen twice before. Not anger and not quite fear, but a species of the two things combined into something that was entirely her own, something that was, he understood, what she looked like when she'd been frightened and was now on the other side of it. She said, "You didn't come back at dark." "The door needed—" "I know about the door," she said. "I watched you through the window for 20 minutes before you came in. I couldn't tell if you were still working or—" She stopped. He looked at her. She was looking at the basin. He said, "Vivian." She said, "Don't tell me I'm overreacting." "I wasn't going to," he said. She looked up. He looked back at her in the lamplight. This woman who had crossed a continent on the basis of 11 letters and stayed through a Nebraska winter without complaint, who had found his accounting errors and fixed his supplier problem and written midnight documents about cattle operations and was currently sitting across from him with her hands flat on the table because she'd been frightened for him and was not going to pretend otherwise. He said, "I should have come in earlier." She said, "Yes, you should have. I'll be more careful." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not asking you to be careful. I'm asking you to remember that you're not alone anymore." She paused. "That's a different thing." He took his hands out of the basin. The left one was returning to color. The right was fine. He dried them on the cloth she'd set out. He said, "You're right." She said, "I know." There was a silence that had a different quality from any of the previous silences in the house, warmer or more settled, or something that didn't have a clean name but that both of them recognized as a change in the atmospheric pressure of the thing they were building together. She got up and went to the stove to heat the supper she'd kept waiting. He stayed at the table. Pocket came over and put his heavy head on Silas's knee, which was something he rarely did, and Silas put his hand on the old dog's head and stayed there. Outside, the wind kept at it, finding every gap, making its usual case for the vastness of everything beyond the walls. Inside, the lamp burned, the stove ticked, the house held. The house, with both of them in it, held differently than it had before. Not larger, not quieter, not easier. Just differently. With a specific gravity that had taken 9 months of letters and 8 months of shared walls to accumulate. The kind of weight that isn't a burden. The kind you build toward without knowing you're building and recognize only when it's finally there. Neither of them said anything more that night. Neither of them needed to. The winter that nearly broke them arrived without particular warning, which was the way the worst winters always came. The first week of December had been cold but manageable, the kind of cold that announces itself honestly, that lets you take inventory and prepare and button down the things that need to be buttoned. Silas had seen worse. He'd told Vivian as much, not to reassure her, but because it was true. And she had nodded in the way she nodded when she was accepting information without necessarily accepting the conclusion it was supposed to lead to. Then, on the 8th of December, the temperature dropped 31 degrees in 6 hours. He'd been watching the sky all morning. There was something in the quality of the light, flat and yellowish in a way that had nothing to do with clouds, that he'd learned, over years on that land, to read as a warning. He'd brought the cattle in from the north pasture by noon, which was early, which cost him the afternoon's other work. He'd reinforced the barn door again. It had held fine since November, but he trusted the yellow light more than the latch. He'd brought in extra wood, more than seemed necessary, which was exactly the right amount. Vivian had been working in the back room they'd added to the house in September. The press room, which was what they'd taken to calling it, though the actual press hadn't arrived yet, was still being assembled by a supplier in Omaha who had missed 2 delivery dates already, and about whom Vivian had written a letter of such precise and controlled displeasure that Silas had read it twice for the pleasure of the construction. She was working on the 3rd issue of the Dry Creek Courier, which was what she'd named it, and which had been running for 6 weeks on a borrowed hand press from a printing operation that had closed in the county seat the previous year, a relic machine that she'd identified, pursued, negotiated for, and acquired in the course of 3 weeks without mentioning it to Silas until she'd already arranged the price. He'd said when she told him, "You didn't think to discuss this with me first." She'd said, "I knew you'd say yes. I was saving us both the time." He'd looked at her for a long moment. "That's not how this works." "I know," she said, and she meant it, and it didn't happen again in the same way, though she continued to be a woman who worked at a pace that left consultation feeling sometimes like an afterthought. They had argued about this, properly. Not the managed kind of argument that people who are afraid of each other have, but the real kind, with specific grievances and raised voices, and the particular difficulty of being wrong in front of someone who knows you well enough to see it clearly. He had been wrong sometimes. She had been wrong sometimes. The arguments ended, always, in the same place. 2 people sitting in the same kitchen, on the same side of something, even when they'd been facing opposite directions for an hour. The courier had been received by Dry Creek the way most things from an unexpected direction are received. First with suspicion, then with the grudging acknowledgement that the suspicious thing was actually useful, then with something close to dependence that nobody admitted to directly. The first issue had contained Vivian's analysis of the shared water rights situation in the county, a 3-page piece that laid out, with the precision of a woman who understood how sentences functioned as arguments, exactly what the ranchers' legal entitlements were, and how 3 of them were paying for access they'd already secured by prior agreement. She had sent copies to every ranch within 12 miles. The response had been split. 2 ranchers came by the house within a week with specific questions and genuine appreciation. One sent back the issue with a note that said, in full, "Women writing about land law. What's next?" Vivian had taped that note to the wall above the borrowed press. Harold Finch had refused to carry the courier at the post office. Vivian had arranged distribution through the feed store instead, which was where people actually went, and which reached more households anyway. She'd said nothing to Harold directly. She didn't need to. The second issue had included a piece on winter preparation for livestock based on interviews Vivian had conducted, by letter, by direct visit when she could get there, with 6 ranchers, including 2 who had initially been skeptical. She'd included their names and attributed their methods, which was something nobody had done before in Dry Creek, and the effect had been unexpected. People who had been watching their neighbors operate for decades and never thinking of them as a source of knowledge suddenly had evidence of being seen as expert, and something about that changed the temperature of certain conversations in town. The third issue was going to include a piece about the county's road conditions and who was and wasn't maintaining the sections they were legally responsible for. This one Silas had concerns about, which he'd raised, and she'd listened to, and then she'd said, "If I only write the things nobody objects to, I'm not writing a paper, I'm writing a pamphlet." He hadn't had a good answer to that. When the temperature dropped on December 8th, Vivian came out of the press room around 3 in the afternoon and found Silas pulling on his coat with a focused expression she'd learned to read as the face he made when something was actually serious. She said, "How bad?" He said, Enough that I'm going to check the barn one more time. The cattle are already in. I know. I want to check the hay stores and the water line. She looked at him with the expression she'd had in November, the one that wasn't quite fear, but adjacent to it. They had not talked about the November night in any explicit way since it happened, but it had changed something in how she tracked his movements on serious weather days, and he'd noticed, and he'd been, not more careful, exactly, but more communicative. He told her where he was going. He gave her a general sense of the timeline. These were small adjustments that cost him nothing except the habit of self-reliance, which was a hard habit and an old one. He said, "An hour, maybe less." She said, "I'll have something hot when you get back." He went out. She went back to the press room, but she didn't work. She sat at her composition table with the third issue's layout in front of her and listened to the wind, which had changed pitch in the hour since lunch, had gone from its regular conversational undertone to something more insistent, more directed. 40 minutes in, she went to the kitchen window and looked at the barn. She couldn't see him. She waited 10 minutes. The light had changed. The yellow quality was gone now, replaced by something closer to gray, the particular gray that preceded serious weather, and the wind was doing something she'd only heard twice before since March, and both times had meant things had gotten bad fast. She put on her coat. She told herself as she was buttoning it that she was being irrational, that he was a man who had survived 11 Nebraska winters on his own, that an hour meant an hour, not 40 minutes, and she was 9 minutes early in her worry. She told herself all of this and went out the back door anyway, into the cold that hit her face like a physical correction, and crossed the yard toward the barn. The barn door was closed, which was right, which meant he'd latched it from inside. She pulled it open. The wind grabbed it immediately, and she had to hold it with both hands, and stepped inside. He was in the far corner of the barn, by the waterline access, and he was sitting down, not resting, sitting in a way that was not chosen. She said his name. She crossed the barn in 10 steps, past the cattle who shifted but did not startle, and crouched down in front of him. His face was the color the cold made it, and his eyes were open but not quite right, not quite focused in the way eyes were supposed to be focused. She said, "Silas, look at me." He looked at her. There was a delay in it, a quarter-second lag that scared her more than anything else. He said, "The valve." His voice was wrong, too slow. She looked at the valve. It was open. He'd opened it to check the line. She could see that. And there was a wrench on the ground beside him, and she understood immediately. He'd been out here longer than 40 minutes. He'd been here since he left the house, and the valve had given him trouble. And he'd been working in the corner of the barn farthest from the door in the coldest part of December, and the cold had gotten into him the way it got into things when they stopped moving. She said, "Can you stand?" He said, "Yes." He didn't move. She put her hands under his arms. He was not a small man, and she was not a large woman, and the next 30 seconds were graceless and effortful and necessary. She got him upright. He took his own weight, which was the thing she needed to know, and she kept her hand on his arm anyway. She said, "We're going to the house." He said, "The valve? The valve is open. The line won't freeze if it's running. We can close it later." She said this with a certainty she was mostly manufacturing, because she'd read enough about water lines to believe it was approximately true, and because the alternative was arguing with a man who had hypothermia about plumbing, and she was not going to do that. They crossed the yard. The wind was worse than it had been 20 minutes ago, and she kept herself slightly upwind of him, which didn't help much, but was something. He was walking on his own by the time they reached the door, which was better, which meant the worst scenario was not this scenario, but she held on to his arm until they were inside. She sat him in the chair nearest the stove. She built the fire up fast. She'd gotten good at the stove, left side hot, right side manageable, and she'd learned when to push it. She brought the basin again. Lukewarm, not hot. She'd made this mistake once with her own hands in October and had read about it afterward. She said, "Take your boots off." He said, "I can do it." She waited. He did it, slowly, and she saw his hands were having the same trouble they'd had in November, and she made a decision she'd been circling for a while. She said, "This is the second time." He said, "I know. In 8 months. Vivian." "I'm not angry," she said. She said it clearly, Because it was true, and she needed him to understand it was true before she said the next part. I'm telling you that I have watched you, twice now, treat your own limits as a problem to be managed alone until the management fails. I understand why. I know where it comes from. She paused. But I need you to understand that I can't watch it and say nothing. I'm not built that way. He looked at her. His color was coming back slowly. The stove was doing its work. He said, I don't do it on purpose. I know that. It's just... He stopped, started again. It's how I've always worked. You solve the problem in front of you until it's solved. Yes, she said. And you've been doing it alone, which meant the only person at risk was you, and you were willing to take that risk, and that was your right. She looked at him steadily. You're not alone anymore. The room was quiet except for the fire. He said finally, You came out in that. Yes. In the middle of a temperature drop. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. There was something in his face that she'd seen before, in fragments. In the moments after arguments when they'd come back to the same side of something. In the morning when she handed him coffee and neither of them said much. In November when he'd sat at the table with his hands in the basin and told her he'd be more careful. The same thing, each time. The face of a man who had been built, deliberately and over years, for solitude. Encountering the persistent evidence that solitude was no longer the structure he was living in. He said, I'm sorry. She said, I'm not asking for sorry. I'm asking you to remember. She paused. You said it to me last November. Remember, you're not alone anymore. I'm saying it back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the particular difficulty of a man for whom this kind of statement had never been necessary before, I'll remember. She nodded. She didn't push it further because she'd said the thing and it had been received, and pushing further would have been about her anxiety rather than his understanding, and she knew the difference. She made supper. He sat by the stove and recovered by degrees, and by the time she put the food on the table, he was entirely himself again, or close enough to it. They ate mostly in silence, but it was the settled kind. The kind that had taken months to build. Pocket lay under the table in his usual position, generating heat against their feet, which was perhaps his best quality. Outside, the storm worked itself up to something serious by midnight. She lay awake and listened to it and thought about the press room and the third issue and the piece about the roads that Silas had reservations about. And she thought about the valve in the barn that was probably fine. And she thought about a letter she'd gotten from her father 2 weeks ago that had been 4 pages long, which was more than he'd ever written in his life, and which had contained, in the 3rd page, buried between a description of Thomas's latest competency and a complaint about the winter's effect on his knees, the sentence, I think you made the right choice, Vivian. I should have said so sooner. She had read that sentence 6 times the day the letter arrived. She had not told Silas about it immediately. She'd held it for a week, private, the way you hold something before you're sure you can talk about it without the talking changing what it is. Then she'd told him. He'd read it. He'd handed the letter back. He'd said, he's a man who needed time to get there. He got there. She'd said, it took him 9 months. He'd said, my father never got there at all. She'd said nothing. He'd gone back to his work. But later that evening, he'd come to the doorway of the press room where she was working and said, your father's a better man than he knows how to show. You knew that. That's why it still mattered when he said it. She'd thought about that for a long time afterward. The storm broke by morning, leaving behind the particular stillness that follows serious weather. Everything coded, everything quieted, the world temporarily simplified by the fact of having survived something. Silas went out before dawn and checked the barn and the water line, which had been fine, which Vivian received with the specific satisfaction of a person who made a judgment call under pressure and turned out to be right. The valve was closed. The cattle were all there. The barn had held. He came back in with the expression he wore after things that could have been bad had turned out not to be. A controlled relief, the face of someone who doesn't celebrate much but notes. She handed him coffee. He said, you were right about the valve. She said, I know. He sat down. She sat across from him. Outside, the snow was doing its usual post-storm brilliance, the kind that was beautiful for about an hour before you had to go work in it. He said, I've been thinking about, about last night. He held the cup in both hands, the way he did when he was choosing words carefully. About what you said, about not being alone. She waited. He said, I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it now rather than at a better moment, because I've been using the absence of better moments as an excuse not to ask it. She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man she'd crossed a continent to sit across from, who had cut his own hair crooked and had a dog with honest opinions, and had written her a letter once that said I never found anyone I could talk to without feeling like I was performing a version of myself I didn't quite recognize. And she felt the particular quality of attention that came to her when something was real. He said, I'd like you to marry me, not because of the arrangement we came here with, because of what this actually is. He paused. I think you know what this is. She looked at him. She thought about the first letter, the fifth draft, the scratched out word, the train schedules, the chair. She said, I do know. He said, Is that a yes? She said, Yes. He nodded. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside the snow was still brilliant and the cattle were alive and the press room was waiting and Pocket was at the door again with his usual expectations. Silas got up and let the dog in. It was not a grand moment. It was a kitchen in December with bad weather outside and a stove that ran hot on the left side and two people who had been working very hard for 9 months to build something neither of them had been sure they were capable of building. It was also, in its own stubborn and unadorned way, everything. They married in February the following month in the county clerk's office in Millard, with a clerk named Patterson who seemed surprised they'd waited this long, and two witnesses who were strangers and who signed without particular ceremony and went back to their own lives immediately after. Vivian had written to her father the week before. He had written back in 3 days, which was the fastest letter he'd ever sent, and it said, among other things, I'm sorry I can't be there. I'd have liked to see it. She'd read that and felt something that was grief and gratitude so completely mixed that they weren't separable. And she'd written back that she understood, and she'd told him about the courier, the full version, the version she'd been parceling out in pieces so as not to overwhelm what was still a fragile epistolary relationship between a man who hated writing letters and a daughter who had inherited, apparently, no such limitation. His response to the courier arrived in March and read, A newspaper. Of course you started a newspaper. I don't know why I'm surprised. Send me a copy. She sent him every issue from then on. The courier grew in ways she had predicted and ways she hadn't. By spring of the first year, it had 12 regular readers who'd specifically requested delivery. By summer, it had 34. She'd gotten the press from Omaha in March. It arrived damaged, one of the rollers cracked in transit, and she and Silas had spent 3 days and 2 arguments figuring out the repair, which in the end worked, imperfectly but functionally, which was how most things in their life worked and which she'd stopped expecting to be otherwise. The road conditions piece ran in issue 4. 2 of the ranchers mentioned by name were irritated. One of them, a man named Doyle, who held a section of the main road between Dry Creek and the county seat and who had not done the required maintenance in 2 years, wrote a letter to the courier disputing her figures. She published his letter and her response in the same issue, side by side, and her response was so precisely sourced and so completely correct that Doyle had the road section graded by the following month. Harold Finch did not read the courier. Officially. In practice, his wife subscribed, which amounted to the same thing, and on 2 occasions, Vivian had seen him in the feed store pick up a copy that someone had set down and hold it for a moment before putting it back. She had not mentioned this to anyone. The thing that changed Dry Creek's relationship to both of them was not the accounting piece, or the road piece, or any of the dozen articles Vivian wrote in the first year about practical matters that affected every family in the county. It was a piece she wrote in October of that year about a family named Rourke. The Rourkes had come to Nebraska from Missouri 2 years earlier and had been failing quietly in the way that frontier families failed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally, the losses accumulating at a rate that slightly outpaced the gains, the margin getting narrower each season. Patrick Rourke had a problem with his leg that made the heavy work increasingly difficult, and that he had not talked about because talking about it required admitting it, and admitting it required facing what it meant. His wife, Margaret, had been doing more of the physical work than was reasonable for one person, and had been saying nothing about that either, which was its own kind of damage. Vivian had found out about the Rourkes through a chance conversation at the feed store, the kind of conversation that happens in a small community when someone is trying to mention something without mentioning it. She'd gone out to their place the following week. She'd sat with Margaret Rourke for 2 hours and listened to things that Margaret had not said out loud to anyone because there had been no one to say them to, and because the act of saying them required someone who would receive them as information rather than pity. She'd written the piece carefully. She'd shown it to Silas first, which she hadn't done with most pieces. Not because she needed his approval, but because this one felt like it was operating at a different frequency, and she wanted another set of eyes on where the line was. He'd read it. He'd handed it back and said, "You found the line." She'd said, "Where is it?" He'd said, "You're on the right side of it, barely." She'd published it. The response was not what she'd expected, which was that people would want to help the Rourkes. They did want to help the Rourkes. But what happened in addition to that was something larger and less predictable. People started talking. Not about the Rourkes specifically, but about the general condition the piece had articulated. The specific isolation of struggling alone in a place where struggle was assumed to be private, where asking for help was treated as a form of failure, where the distance between homesteads made it easy to not know that your neighbor was in exactly the same water you were in. She hadn't set out to write a piece about community. She'd set out to write about the Rourkes, but she'd accidentally named something that a lot of people recognized, and the recognition had an effect she could measure in the conversation she began to have, in the feed store, outside the telegraph office, in the 2 or 3 visits that came to the door in the weeks after publication from people who wanted to talk about something she'd said. Silas noticed the shift. He said one evening, "You understand what you're doing, right?" She said, "What am I doing?" He said, "You're giving people a language for things they didn't have words for." She looked at him. He said it without portentousness, the way he said most things, directly, without decoration, as a simple observation. But she felt it land. She said, "I learned from someone who wrote a very unusual advertisement." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his honest face. Not the public one, not the competent rancher face or the steady neighbor face, but the one that was just him, undressed of all the self-management. "That advertisement," he said, "was the most frightening thing I ever sent out into the world." "I know," she said. "That's how I knew it was real." The Courier ran an anniversary issue in its second year, 41 subscribers, distribution at the feed store, the telegraph office, and now by arrangement with a neighboring county's mail route. Vivian had written 23 issues plus 2 special editions and had learned to run the press alone, which had taken 4 months and 2 ruined press cylinders and one very bad afternoon where she'd had ink on every surface, including the ceiling, which she had cleaned up herself before Silas came in from the cattle, and which she never mentioned because it was a defeat she'd chosen to file under private. She was pregnant with their first child by the second spring, which was both expected and, in the actual fact of it, completely startling, the way things are when they cross from the category of things you know intellectually into the category of things happening to your body. She told Silas on a Tuesday morning in April, before either of them had spoken much, setting his coffee down and then standing there with an expression he'd never seen on her before, not uncertain exactly, but more open than her usual face, more exposed. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I'm going to have to stop carrying the press trays for a while." He understood what she was telling him. He sat down. She sat down too. They stayed there for a while, in the kitchen, with the stove doing its thing and Pocket snoring in the corner. He was old, very old by this point, moving slowly and sleeping more. And the morning light coming through the window that faced east, which was not the romantic window, which was just the window that let in the most light for the most hours. He said, "I'm going to build a cradle." She said, "You're going to build a good one or a fast one?" He thought about it. "Good one." "Then you'd better start soon." He started that weekend. The baby was a girl. They named her Ruth, which was Vivian's mother's name, a woman who had died when Vivian was 6 and who existed mostly as a quality of light in her memory, a warmth, a particular laugh, the way certain kinds of late afternoon sun still made her feel something she couldn't name. Silas had said, when she told him the name she was considering, "Then that's the name," without hesitation, without weighing it against other options, and she'd registered that as the kind of thing she filed away and returned to, the way she returned to certain sentences in the letters. Ruth was born in November, which was not the ideal month for anything in Nebraska, but was the month she chose, and was healthy and loud and had, from approximately the second hour of her life, opinions about most things. Silas held her in this kitchen on the first night home from the neighbor woman who had served as midwife, and he looked at her with the expression he'd had on the platform at Millard County, that particular quality of being confronted with something real, larger than expected, requiring adjustment, not diminished by the adjustment. He said quietly, "She looks like you." Vivian, who was tired in ways that were not available for description, said, "She looks like a person who doesn't sleep." He said, "She's been alive for 2 days." "Already a character flaw," Vivian said, and he laughed, the same laugh she'd provoked in him in the first letters, the real one that came from somewhere he didn't usually leave open. Pocket died the following January. Peacefully, which was the word people used and which was true in the sense that nothing dramatic happened and he was not in visible distress, but was also insufficient because there was nothing peaceful about the morning Silas went to wake the dog and couldn't. He didn't say much about it. He buried him in the south corner of the yard where the ground was softer and came back in and had his coffee and said, to nobody in particular, he was a good dog. Vivian said, "The most honest animal I ever knew." Silas looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's right." Ruth, at 2 months old, had no opinion on the matter, but it should be noted that the corner of the yard where Pocket was buried became, over the following years, her favorite place to go when she needed to think something through, which was something that happened with increasing frequency as she grew into the kind of person who had a great many things to think through. The second child was a boy. They named him Edmund, which required no explanation between the two of them, and which Edmund Hale in Boston received, when the letter arrived, by sitting down in the chair in the print shop where he'd taught his daughter her alphabet and being quiet for a long time before he wrote back. What he wrote back was long for him, which meant 4 pages and was the most direct thing he'd ever said to Vivian, which meant that he said several things he'd been withholding for years, and she read it in the press room alone and came out with her eyes red and went immediately to find Silas, which she didn't always do with things that affected her, and told him about it. He said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said he was proud of me. He said he should have told me he was proud of me when I was 15 and learning the type cases, and he was sorry he hadn't." She paused. "He said Thomas Greer is running the shop better than he ever did." Silas looked at her. "That last part cost him." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you. It cost him, and he said it anyway." They had one more child after Edmund, another girl they named Clara, who arrived in the summer of the 4th year and was, in temperament, an almost exact combination of both parents, Silas's steadiness and Vivian's precision, and the particular stubbornness that they had apparently contributed in equal measure, which made her simultaneously very manageable and entirely impossible depending on the day. The courier continued. By the 5th year, it had reach in 3 counties, which Vivian had not planned and could not have predicted and had arranged for anyway, because the mechanism was there and the need was there, and she had never been someone who left working mechanisms unused. She'd hired, by the 4th year, a young woman from the county seat named Alice Burrows, who could set type faster than anyone Vivian had seen since Thomas Greer, and who had opinions about grammar that were occasionally even more specific than Vivian's own, which was saying something. The ranch continued. Silas had expanded by the 3rd year, buying a section of adjacent land when it came available, not impulsively, but after a careful consideration that had lasted 4 months and included several long conversations with Vivian about the financial analysis she'd run 3 different ways. The operation was sound. It was not extravagant, was not the largest or best known in the county, was not anything that the magazines that occasionally wrote about frontier success stories would have found particularly photogenic. It was a working ranch run by 2 people who worked, and the work showed in the accounts and in the land and in the quality of the animals and in the fence that never went unrepaired for more than a week after it needed attention. Calloway had, over the years, arrived at something close to respect. It had taken time and several more encounters that were frank, in the way frontier encounters tended to be frank, directly, without much softening, but he'd gotten there. He'd subscribed to the Courier in the 3rd year. He hadn't announced this. He'd simply shown up at the feed store on distribution day and taken a copy along with everything else. And Vivian had watched this happen from across the store and had said nothing, and continued to say nothing, and continued to distribute the paper to whoever came for it. Harold Finch's wife had, by year 3, stopped pretending to be the subscriber and simply told him directly that she thought the Courier was the most useful publication in the county, which had resulted in an argument that Harold had lost, and after which the Courier had begun being left openly on the post office counter alongside the other available reading materials. Harold had not made any statement about this. Neither had Vivian. In the 6th year, Silas built something else. He didn't tell her what he was building until it was nearly done. He'd been working on it in the mornings before she was awake, and on the days when she was in town with the paper and she'd noticed the evidence of construction materials and asked once what he was doing, and he'd said, "Something I should have done sooner," which was his equivalent of telling her to wait. It was a proper workspace, not just the added press room, which had always been a practical addition, functional rather than deliberate. This was a room at the front of the house, west-facing, with a window that was wider than any other window in the house, that caught the afternoon light. He'd built a desk into it, properly proportioned, with shelves for the reference materials she kept stacked in unstable columns in the press room, and a place for the compositing tools she used for the Courier's layout, and a chair that was the right height, which he'd figured out by watching her work and noticing, over months, the exact height at which her shoulders relaxed. She stood in the doorway of it on the morning he showed her, and was quiet for longer than she was usually quiet. He stood behind her. He said, "The chair's the right height. I measured it." She said, "I know, I can see that." "The window gets light until about 4. "Yes." She went in. She stood at the desk. She put her hands on it. She looked out the window, which faced the same direction as the porch, which meant it faced the same direction as the chairs, west, out over the plains that went on in that way they had, enormous and indifferent, and also, she'd learned, not indifferent at all, but simply quiet in a language that took time to learn. She said, "You built this." He said, "Yes." She turned around. He was in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed in the way he stood when he was trying not to look like he was waiting for something. She said, "You built me a room." He said, "You built me a life. It seemed like a fair trade." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the best sentence you've ever said out loud." He said, "I had help, 7 years of correspondence." She went to him. She didn't say anything further, and neither did he, and neither of them were people who made much of sentiment in the obvious ways. They weren't given to grand gestures or performed emotion, and this was not something that had changed. But she put her hand on his arm, the way she'd held his arm in the November of that first year when she'd walked him out of the cold barn, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood there in the doorway of the room he'd built her, with the west light coming through the window and the plains outside, doing their enormous quiet thing, and the sounds of 3 children somewhere in the house behind them, and Alice Burroughs' latest draft of the Courier's front page waiting on the new desk. There is something worth saying here about what this story is actually about, because it is not, finally, about a man who built a house before he found someone to fill it. That is where it starts, but not where it lives. What it is about is simpler and harder than that. It is about 2 people who each decided, separately and at some cost, to say the true thing rather than the convenient thing, and then to keep doing it in the face of every reason not to. It would have been easier for Silas to fill the chair with proximity. Someone local, someone available, someone who would have made the practical arrangement that most of his neighbors had made and that worked, after a fashion, for most of them. He didn't do it not because he was romantic, but because he was honest, and honesty, in that particular context, cost him years of Harold Finch's amusement and Calloway's commentary and the particular social tax that small communities levy on people who want something different from what the community has decided is appropriate. It would have been easier for Vivian to stay. She was needed there. The need was real. And the harder truth, the one she'd been honest about in the letter that started everything. The one where she admitted she didn't know what she was looking for, only that something wouldn't leave her alone, was that staying would have been the kind of not choosing that passes for safety until you realize, too late, that you chose it anyway by default. She didn't stay. She wrote the fifth draft. She got on the train. And what she found in Nebraska was not what she'd imagined, because nothing is what you imagine, because the imagined version of a life is always cleaner and quieter than the life. And the life requires you to be wrong sometimes and difficult often and afraid regularly and still show up and do the thing in front of you. She showed up. So did he. The story does not end with a sunset, because life does not end with sunsets. It ends mid-sentence, usually in the middle of something you were working on, and the point is not the ending, but the accumulation of what you built along the way. What they built was a ranch that worked, a paper that mattered, a house full of children who knew how to argue and how to listen because they had parents who did both, badly sometimes, in front of them. What they built was a marriage that was not a romance, or was a romance, but one that bore no resemblance to the word as most people used it, which implied something effortless, something that arrived complete rather than something you constructed out of negotiation and honesty, and the specific willingness to stay in the room when leaving would have been easier. The two chairs were still on the porch in the 7th year. The one on the right was more weathered than the one on the left because that was the one Silas had always used, and now used slightly less because Vivian used the left one more than she'd expected to. They didn't match anymore, the two chairs. They had the distinct look of objects that had been used differently over time, that had taken on the particular character of their use. On an evening in September of that 7th year, with the days shortening again and the first suggestion of autumn in the air, they were both on the porch, which happened when the children were in bed and the day's work was done, which didn't happen every evening but happened enough to be a thing they had without naming it. Ruth was 9 now and had a notebook she carried everywhere, and Edmund was 6 and had Silas's hands already and Vivian's impatience with imprecision, and Clara was 3 and had views on most subjects that she stated without context or preamble, which they had decided to treat as a feature. The plains in September did something different than in any other month. The light came at an angle that reminded Vivian of the window at 2 in the afternoon, the dead elm, the cobblestones going briefly into another century. She'd thought of that window less over the years, not forgotten it, just moved it to a different room in herself, the room that held things that were complete. Silas said, "The south fence needs work before winter." She said, "I know, I saw it last week." "You didn't mention it." "I was waiting to see if you'd notice." He looked at her sideways. "And?" "You noticed," she said. Eventually. He was quiet for a moment. The evening was doing what Nebraska evenings did, which was more than the word evening usually contained. A full sky, the particular immensity of flat land under a high atmosphere, the way things got both larger and more specific as the light declined. He said, "I have something to tell you." She turned to look at him. He had that face, the honest one, the undressed one. He said, "I've been thinking about the advertisement, about what I was trying to say in it, and whether I said it correctly, and whether it matters." He paused. "I think what I was trying to say was that I wanted a witness, not a helper, not a partner in the business sense. A witness. Someone who would know what was actually happening and remember it correctly." She watched him. He said, "I got more than I said." She said quietly, "Yes, so did I." The light moved across the plains the way it did, taking its time, the way it always had, and would continue to do regardless of the small specific drama of two people on a porch making sense of what they'd made. The chairs held them. The house behind them held what it held. The children were asleep. The cattle were in. The press room was dark and would be lit again in the morning, and the ranch would require what it required, and none of it was finished, none of it was complete. That was the thing about building, the real thing, the thing nobody told you. You didn't finish. You built until you couldn't, and what you left standing was what you'd made, and it either held or it didn't, and the only way to know was to build honestly. She put her hand on the arm of her chair. He put his hand on the arm of his. Their hands were a few inches apart in the cooling air. Neither of them moved to close the distance, because neither of them needed to. It was already closed. It had been closing, letter by letter, mile by mile, argument by argument, winter by winter, for 7 years. The advertisement had asked for someone who understood what he meant by deliberate. She had. She did. She always would. The chairs sat on the west-facing porch, as they always had, holding two people who had looked at the honest version of a life they wanted and chosen it anyway, knowing it would be harder than the imagined version, knowing it would ask more than they thought they had, knowing that the asking was the point, that the things worth building are always the things that cost you something, and the things that cost you something are the only things that last.